This is Buffalo State Data Talk, the podcast where we introduce you to how data is used and explore careers that involve data.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Buffalo State Data Talk. I'm your host, Heather Campbell, and thank you for joining us for episode 14. Today, we'll be talking to Tristan Keelan, the Director of Business Development for Community Connections of New York, or CCNY, a nonprofit management services organization, and host of their Data Doesn't Equal Outcomes podcast. Welcome to the show, Tristan.
Thanks for having me, Heather. It's nice to be here.
Could you start us off by telling us a bit about CCNY and what you do for the company?
Sure. So at CCNY, we're a data and analytics organization. And what we do is we help other nonprofits really assess the outcomes that their programs are producing. And as the director of business development, I work with those nonprofits to really match them with the right solution. And I say right solution because there's more than one way to evaluate a program. And very often what an organization wants or thinks they need is not the same as what they do need. So we kind of need to have that back and forth to really, get at kind of that root need. And so I act as that liaison between our data analysts, our program evaluators, and the clients to really sort of get that mapping.
Excellent. And so could you tell me a little bit about, a typical day or what a typical week looks like for you in your position?
Sure. So I spend a lot of time talking with potential clients, and it's not, somebody who needs a program evaluation. It's not like buying off the rack. You can't just walk in, buy your program evaluation, and walk out the door, right? So most of my time is spent, a lot of back and forth. Usually there's multiple calls with a client to really, ask those critical questions and really make sure that what we agree to deliver for them is in fact what they need delivered.
Yeah, it sounds like you spend a lot of your time asking questions and more questions and more questions.
Very, very much so, yeah.
So going back a little bit to the actual data that your team uses to do this analysis, how are you storing this data? Are you storing it, in the cloud, or is there a specific program you use?
Yeah, so we typically, in terms of storage and where does it go, we like to work on our client's environment. So rather than sort of taking their data, we create ways for them to give us access to their environment, whether it's their cloud, or whether it's their local server, because that way we can know that when we're finished, the work that we're leaving them will in fact work on their systems and their hardware and their software. If we do it, on our end and then try to pass it over, any number of things can go wrong. Oh, that system's not compatible with the hardware that we have. We would have run into that and encountered that and corrected that had we known. So we prefer to work on our client's environment in that way.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, technology can be a huge barrier, and often people don't necessarily want to learn a whole new program. So if you're already using something that they have, that makes a lot of sense.
And I think what's, underestimated lately is not all the hardware out there is created equal, especially when it comes to data and large data sets. There's programs that, might run really smoothly on, your i7 processor that when you hand it over to your client on an i3 processor, they can't even open it. And if you haven't negotiated those things, you can take a lot of really good work and find it unusable. Or you forced your client to now buy a new computer when maybe that could have been avoided. So we use SQL Server from Microsoft. You'd be surprised, or maybe not surprised, how much data just still navigates through Excel. But we can work in Tableau. We prefer to work in Microsoft Power BI as our data visualization tool. It seems to be the most sort of accessible for our clients. really, Excel is still the pivot point for data. You're either going from systems to Excel to Power BI very often. If we're lucky, we can use API integrations to connect directly to systems, but not always.
Yeah, I know that some data scientists think that we, shouldn't use Excel. Excel is not a data science product, and some people absolutely love using Excel for data science. So it's interesting to hear that a lot of people are still using that for their data.
I think that the visualization tools like Power BI and like Tableau and those have really reminded us that at its core, Excel is a database. Before you color code anything, before you, for a long time, it's been easy to use Excel for its display functionality, merge a couple cells so that you can put a header on it. And, those kinds of things were very popular until now we're visualizing things in, actually these really, really fantastic visualization tools, but they require that if you pull data in from Excel, that it's formatted like a database and nothing else. So I would say Excel's become even more important, but it's playing a slightly different role because, there's less pivot table happening because that's happening over in the other systems. There's less, display color coding type functionality because that's happening in the other systems. But as a conduit, as a common mechanism to get from whatever software you're using, there's almost always an export to Excel feature. That's really the most common. I mean, we can pretend like it's not. There's some huge companies where you can directly connect, but most people aren't using huge company. I mean, most people are using softwares that don't connect directly. So you need to pass it through Excel. So I think it's almost more important than ever.
One of the things that you mentioned, talking about, having your Excel be a database and not having it color-coded and merged cells and everything, I'm assuming that's a little bit part of cleaning up the data that you need to do. So once you have access to the data and you've done all of that cleaning that you need to be able to analyze it, what happens next? How is the data actually being used and analyzed?
When I talk about cleaning up the data, just an example, if your Excel sheet has a column of numbers and if they have a total, right? If they total up at the end, well, your visualization tool is going to add them all up and add your total. So you need to get that total out of there. We work on something called utilization focused evaluation. And it's really easy, especially for data scientists, to just get too big and too deep. And our model of utilization focus says, if your client can't use it at the end, then it shouldn't have been done. And so when we very often, you want to build something that's really awesome, but it could be, and I don't mean to downplay the intelligence of our clients, because that's not it at all. What it is they don't live and breathe this stuff, right? And they don't need data and awesome dashboards. They need answers to questions and they need to solve problems, right? The data scientist can get too hung up in, look at this, you can click here, it filters over here, it does all this stuff, and you can answer this question. Well, they only need to answer this question. So what we need to do is give them that answer. And so really sort of taking that step back and making sure that you're working with your client to deliver something that can be understood and can be used and almost has a planned action behind it. Like that client should know if the metric dips below a certain amount, we know what to do. We're ready to go and ready to intervene. So really building those final deliverables with that utility in mind.
So you perfectly led me into my next question, which was the deliverables. You already mentioned dashboards, but What is it that you typically are giving to your clients in the end? Dashboards, written reports, papers, presentations?
Sure, all of the above. But, you know, you mentioned dashboards, and I think that that one of the parts of what I get to do that's really important is everybody usually tells us what they need as a dashboard. I need a dashboard that shows me this. And it's because that's the way we're sort of being trained to think in visual analytics. Everything's a dashboard. And when we got down to it, you know, they didn't actually need a dashboard. They had to submit raw numbers to a reporting entity. So every month they were required to submit. So a visual dashboard actually doesn't help them. It only forces them to find those digits and manually enter them somewhere else. So, you know, we were able to uncover that, you know, hey, lo and behold, to solve this problem, you actually need an Excel output that has those numbers that you can upload instead of a dashboard, so that you can manually find them and then manually upload them.
So could you talk about a specific challenge that you or your company or your team had to overcome, and how did you solve it? And, you know, maybe what went wrong along the way and how did you fix those things?
Yeah. So in a previous life, I worked at a social services provider, and I was working with a preventive services program, and they had this goal bestowed upon them, right, by the county, to meet all new clients referred into the program within 24 hours. And it's really hard to do. You can call people, they don't have to answer, they don't have to call you back. It's one of those metrics that that the average person says, well, we'll report on it, but there's nothing we can do about it to make it better. And so what we were instituting was an assessment tool for this program. It was already in place, but we weren't really collecting the data very well, though. It's called the North Carolina Family Assessment, or the NCFAS, as it's more commonly referred to. And it measures, how well a family is doing. And we would measure it pre and post, but it was being written down on paper and just kind of filed away. So I recommended, let's do a pilot project. I said, let's take one caseworker, just one, and let's collect their data. Let's get it manually entered into Excel. Let's get the relationship built to the rest of the data set. And let's just see, give me one person for a month collecting these things. And I want to take a look and see what we can do. And the results of that were, we measure the delta, right? So the mathematical calculation is for each case, what is the pre-test score, post-test score, and the difference in between is what we're going to call our outcome measure. And we look at that in aggregate for this one caseworker over the course of our test period. And what we're able to do is take that delta, and you can filter it by a whole bunch of other criteria. So does that delta get better or worse when other variables are applied? And so the first one that we applied was the client seen within 24 hours. And it was amazing. Clients that were seen within 24 hours had overall improvements, almost double those that were not seen within 24 hours. So all of a sudden, we went back to the caseworkers and said, okay, look, two things. First, we're going to collect this data for everybody because it tells us a lot. And now we can, my tenure didn't get far enough, but we're going to look at other ways to collect it besides paper, right? The second piece is look at the difference in your case outcomes when you achieve this seemingly arbitrary metric up front. And it's not arbitrary. It's about engagement. And clients who get engaged quickly, it's almost like a hook. Like you brought them into the program, you get that buy-in right away. And all of a sudden the attitude changes from, oh, that's not something we can impact to, well, we have to find a way to impact that because look at how much impact it's having on our final case results.
It's really great that you guys were able to go in and show the reason behind why these people needed to connect with these people in 24 hours. I mean, if somebody told me, oh, you need to do it, I'll be okay, sure, all right, I'll try. And it doesn't work. And you're like, okay, well, I don't really care because, whatever. But then somebody comes in and says, this is important because it's actually leading to benefits to your clients. Then you have a reason to do it. You have, I think that's really, really powerful. And it's cool that you were able to show that with the data.
I think what we saw is the mindset shifted from, well, I called them and I called them again and nobody called me back. Then you started hearing things like, no, I call once, I call again in 2 hours, I call again in 5 hours. And if not, I drive to the house, right? Like you start hearing, things like it becomes, when I get a new case, it's becoming a priority.
So I wanted to talk to you about something else that you mentioned when we talked previously that was important to you, and you mentioned it very briefly earlier. And it was also a topic of one of your previous podcast episodes, trauma-informed data. So could you tell us what is trauma-informed data and why is it important to you?
The principle comes from a therapeutic methodology with trauma-informed care. It's the assumption that all of us have gone through some kind of trauma, some level of trauma. But if we all approach our interactions with people that we come across with the assumption that we don't know what that person's gone through, and it could have been something significant, then we tend to treat those people in that way. And it's very important in the therapeutic relationship to understand that people's pasts are contributing very much to their present. In the data realm, I discovered very quickly that data is traumatizing to people, especially when it measures their performance. And the way that I've come to describe this is when we're in school, traditional K through 12 plus college type of an education, we're given grades on assignments, we're given grades on, classes, and we're given, final GPAs, right? So our experience with scoring mechanisms, and this goes across the board for everybody, is they're presented as final. When you're done with the math test, you get a score, you don't take that particular test again. Now, when we get into the working world, the pivot on this concept is substantial. Instead of having new tests and new course material all the time, the measurements tend to stay static. If you're in a mental health clinic, you measure no-show rate constantly. The measure doesn't change. It's number of appointments attended divided by total number of appointments scheduled, right? And the measure won't change, but you keep measuring it week over week, month over month, year over year, trying to either improve it or keep it at a certain level. And we're simply not prepared for that type of scoring mechanism. And what happens when we do that is it's very threatening to have your performance measured because we're so conditioned to that's the stamp on our performance. And really, we need to shift our focus from data as a finality to data as a means to improvement, data as insight that we can try to get better at. I think that data scientists have an immense amount of power, but also an immense amount of responsibility when communicating numbers and measures with their stakeholders. You almost have to become the therapist for them. Hey, I'm about to show you something. You're not going to like it, and that's okay. I think that any industry can benefit from data scientists that shake that mindset and remind people that we measure data for quality improvement instead of measuring data for getting people in trouble.
Do you have any suggestions of some resources or anything that you could share if anybody was more interested in this topic?
CCNY is actually publishing an ebook that'll be available in December that maps all the principles of trauma-informed care to how they can be applied in a data setting. So we will very shortly have a comprehensive ebook on the topic. So
excellent. And we can link that in the description of the episode too.
Sure. Yep.
So if somebody was interested in working in data, do you have any suggestions of, what kind of training or education that they would need?
The number one recommendation I would have is learn your tools with data that you know. And here's what I mean by that. I'm going to use Power BI as an example. I didn't learn Power BI using healthcare data because I didn't know healthcare data. I used sales and marketing data, and that's how I learned the tool. Because when I made a report, I knew my data and I knew what it should. I knew it could pass or not pass my own smell test, right? Like I would know, oh no, that's not right. I didn't get that formula right, and I could keep working on it.
I love that advice. I think that's excellent because, as you were saying, that intuition of whether you got something wrong or not, you're not going to have on data that you don't understand. And it's really hard to build that intuition working on something that you don't know anything about. So I think that's excellent advice. So switching things up just a little bit, are you able to set aside time for professional development? And if so, what kind of activities do you do?
Believe it or not, I'm finding LinkedIn to be the best place to learn. Following the right people, following the right hashtags, and if we're all on our phones and on social media anyway, I guess doing it in a place where people are sharing advice and tips, and that's where I see all the Power BI product updates end up coming through there. So I found that the LinkedIn community has been a really great place to learn.
So you are the host of the CCNY Data Doesn't Equal Outcomes podcast. So could you tell us very briefly about what is on your podcast?
The genesis of that title is, for the social services industry that we serve, there's still a lot of people trying to get to their data or create data in the first place. Now, the common phrase that I've heard is, I need data and outcomes. And that's just stuck with me for the longest time because they're not the same. And they can't be lumped together. Data is just numbers. It's just what happened. It's just some numerical definition of the past. An outcome is a betterment. It's something that, just because it can be mathematically shown doesn't mean it doesn't fall into that data. It means more than a data point. An outcome means somebody got better. An outcome means somebody's not sick anymore. We need to make sure that we recognize that just because we have data doesn't mean we're doing the best. It doesn't mean we're producing the right outcomes. And so our podcast is really just about all those things that have to happen in order for outcomes to exist, besides the data. And so we like to tell stories about, what are the interventions? What did you do because of the data?
Well, I highly recommend our listeners check out the Data Doesn't Equal Outcomes podcast. I've listened to a couple of episodes and they're really interesting. And your most recent episode had a very exciting guest, one of the Buffalo State data science graduates, Mohammad Haque. And we'll link the episode in the description.
Absolutely.
So Tristan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
And to all of our listeners, if you haven't already, check out our previous podcasts. They're available wherever you listen to podcasts. For more information about starting your career as a data scientist, go to dataanalytics.buffalostate.edu. And don't forget to subscribe so that you get a notification each time we release a new episode of Buffalo State Data Talk.